Young people are sort of impatient. They're called the born freeze in South Africa.
Here at GZERO, we usually take on big global topics that impact multiple countries. Today's show is a little different. We'll talk about just one, South Africa. It's a country that once captured world attention when it transitioned from apartheid regime to modern democracy. But the nation's long walk to freedom is falling short of what was promised. Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to GZERO World. Today, I'll talk about what's keeping one of Africa's largest economies from surging forward. Then I'll sit down with the first woman to work there as America's ambassador. And of course, I've got your puppet regime.
For years of America putting food on the table for you freeloaders, all of you out.
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on.
No more talking, we are now talking about action.
That victory was your victory.
Inequality, unemployment, economic exclusion, and competition for scarce resources.
South Africa. It's a nation of tremendous untapped potential with millions of young people looking to work. It's also a place with a long and brutal history, with soaring public debt, grim public services, and yawning inequality. But now there's a chance for something new. General elections are coming up, the 6th since the end of apartheid. Though the size of South Africa's black middle class has more than doubled, by some measures, the nation is worse off now than it was a decade ago. There are three main reasons why, but before we get into that, let's flip back a few pages to sort out how we got here. The year was 1990. Tensions were rising over apartheid, a decades-old system of racial segregation, which was just starting to be dismantled. The discontent was real as protesters took to the streets in Johannesburg. Clashes with government forces seemed all but inevitable. And then it happened. But that was then. Just 4 years later, Nelson Mandela was elected South Africa's first black president, and his party, the African National Congress, swept into power, promising the kind of reforms that millions of South Africans had long been waiting for. So what happened? Well, for starters, if you're under 30 years old in South Africa today, you don't remember apartheid. Nelson Mandela may also be more monument than man. For you, the ruling party, known as the ANC, is not the party of liberation, as they like to call themselves. It's the party of power. As far as progress, it's been slow. While you don't remember apartheid, you're still dealing with its legacy. Today in South Africa, unemployment is almost 4 times higher for black youth than for whites. And if you're young, there's a good chance you don't have work. The unemployment rate for young South Africans is nearly 40%. But now you've got a choice to make. There's an election coming up, and it's happening at a time of growing political and economic unrest. Let's look at those three main challenges in South Africa today. First, the economy. South Africa enjoyed boom times for the gold, platinum, diamonds, and coal it produced and exported. Then the global financial crisis hit in 2008. Demand for all those things slowed, and the nation's economy still hasn't recovered. Second, corruption. Former President Jacob Zuma took it to another level, and he's faced nearly 800 separate counts of corruption charges. That kind of thing usually puts the brakes on any sort of economic reform. Third, apartheid's legacy. The dusty, sprawling townships and poor villages where many Black South Africans still live continue to keep people at a distance from the chance to learn and work. What's their future? What happens when their frustrations boil over? How will the African National Congress, once the beating heart of resistance to opposition, respond the next time its dominance is tested? Will this time be different? National elections are on the calendar, and South Africans aren't the only ones paying attention. But there's much more to what's happening on the continent. Now here's the rest of my conversation with U.S. former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Jendayi Frazer.
Ambassador Jendayi Frazer.
Yes, hello.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Senior Director, Africa, White House, former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, first female ambassador to South Africa, both sides of the aisle administrations, now adjunct senior fellow here at the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Did I miss anything?
No, I think you got it all.
Great. Let's start we don't spend enough time as Americans talking about, thinking about Africa. Bring us there for a moment. What's the thing that surprises people the most from the expectations that they do or don't have?
I think that there's probably two things that surprise people. One, for people who've never been to Africa, it's the size of the continent. It's tremendous. It's a huge, huge continent. You know, it can hold the United States, Europe, China, and many other countries in it itself. So it's a big continent, a very diverse continent. We often talk about
World
Africa.
maps actually really misstate the size.
They
of
completely
Africa,
misstate
perception.
the size. And so I think that, you know, people go there and they're surprised, you know, because it takes 14, 18 hours to get anywhere, you know, across the continent. And so I think the size of it and the diversity of it, we talk about in Africa as if it's one place when it's 54 different countries, you know, at least 3,000 ethnic groups, 2,000 languages. It's a tremendously diverse continent. So that's one thing. The second is, I think that people think of it as, you know, wild animals, you know, but it's actually quite urbanized. There are major cities in Africa and huge mega cities, in fact, in Africa. If you think about Johannesburg or Cairo or Lagos, these are multi-million, you know, population size. And so I think both the urbanization and the size of the continent are probably the two most surprising aspects of it that many people, when they, you know, watch TV or something, miss often.
And in the cities in Africa, Africa's not as urbanized as China is today, for example. Still, most of the continent is living in rural areas. How quickly is that changing?
It's changing extremely quickly. I think it went from about 28% to 40% in a very short period of time. And so part of what the African leadership has to do is try to make sure to create jobs and make sure that the agricultural sector and the rural areas are being developed, so that there won't be this huge migration of people from their farms or from rural regions into these mega cities, which then lead to huge slums. And so I think that it's very quickly urbanizing, and also you see that, you know, young people have a prejudice about being in agriculture. We have to change the image of agriculture as something that's sexy to do, you know, not toiling the soul with a rake or something, but actually, you know, using information technology and other technologies to be able to do modern agriculture in Africa. And so I think that really trying to curb and stop the urbanization is important, but it is very rapid.
There had been such hope for South Africa for such a long time. You look at the corruption, you look at the security, you look at the unemployment, you look at Cape Town running out of water. It feels like a litany of problems. And yet we have a new leader that everyone's saying is going to be awesome.
Well, he is awesome. But whether he'll be able to manage all of these difficulties, which are historical, is a question, right? I mean, there's excitement about Africa. If you think about it, in just almost a week's time, Mugabe left. Zuma
From
left.
Zimbabwe, from South Africa,
from South
yes.
Africa. Prime Minister Haile Mariam stepped down. I mean, this all took place in about a week's time.
And none of these were people that wanted to step down.
We were getting whiplash,
Yeah.
with the political change that was taking place. It was actually quite shocking. And in the case of South Africa, the economy, there's structural problems in the economy. Those structural problems were there when Mandela was there, when Thabo Mbeki was there. Certainly Zuma exacerbated them with all of the corruption that took place under his term. And now Cyril Ramaphosa was inheriting those problems. Those problems date back to, the Land Act of 1914 when Africans were pushed off of the land and not allowed to own it, and 14% of the population, being white people, were able to own the land. You've got to do land reform. You have to figure that out. You can't continue to have that situation where so many young people in South Africa are unemployed right now, right? Where the education quality needs to be increased so that basically the majority population has been disenfranchised from the economy, is the way I would put it. They've got the vote, but they don't have quote unquote economic freedom. And I'm not trying to use, the language of the opposition, the Economic Freedom Party, but the Malema's group, right? But the fact that that Malema's group is having such an influence within the universities, right? They're winning university representative councils.
Big demonstrations across
Big demonstrations.
the country.
It really shows that young people are sort of impatient. They're called the born frees in South Africa, and they don't have the same necessary loyalty to the ANC that their parents did because the ANC liberated them. These are born frees. Yeah, the African National Congress.
It's the main party in South
The main
Africa.
party, which will continue to rule South Africa for, I believe, a decade or so, right? At least.
No, but what do you think really went wrong? I mean, again, I understand that when you move from an apartheid system, there's a lot that needs to be undone.
Yes.
But, I mean, Mandela was an extraordinary man, an inspirational leader,
Yes.
and certainly not a corrupt one. And yet, the system seemed to become so sclerotic in the aftermath of apartheid. And as you say, there are so many young people in South Africa right now that just are not aligned with the system.
Yes.
The system that should be there for them.
Yes.
So what happened? You were there on the ground.
Yeah, I think that we all celebrate the end of apartheid, but we don't recognize that it was a compromised end, right? There was a way in which Mandela was able to keep society together. And he made tremendous compromises. Some of those compromises was with how fast the economy was going to be transferred over to Black ownership, let's just put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So he made those compromises which were necessary. He stepped down, Thabo Mbeki comes in. You have the Black economic empowerment agenda, but that Black economic empowerment, which basically says that Black people have to own a certain amount of the corporations and get a certain amount of the business, but it goes to an elite and often to a political elite, i.e. that the top leadership of the ANC, who struggled and obviously expected some benefits from having done so. And so that even when you have Black economic empowerment, you continue to have an elite strata, and it's not touching down deep into the economy to where most Black people reside. And so I think that hasn't yet success there. The policy is still there, but they need to now make it, as they've called it, broad Black economic empowerment, and so that they create a more inclusive economy. And so I think that that's part of the challenge. Also, South Africa is tied into the global system when you have its economy is very diversified, but it's not really industrial. It's still very much driven by commodities. And when you have a slowdown in global demand for commodities, it's obviously going to impact the economy there. And so, getting economic growth in that economy has been a challenge.
Let me move you to big picture for a second.
Yes.
Really young population across almost all of Africa, and family sizes vastly greater than we see anywhere else.
Yeah.
So if there is a population time bomb happening in the world, it's happening in Africa.
Sure.
How capable are the governments of the region to deal with that explosion?
Well, that's the big challenge. That is today's primary challenge for African countries. The continent population is about 1.25 billion right now, representing about 17% of the world population. In 20 years,
But only about 3% of the world's economic production.
absolutely. And in about 30 years, it'll be about 40% of the world population.
From 12%?
From 17%, 17% to 40%.
From 17%
Yes,
today
yes,
to 40% of the world's population we expect by
about 2063.
2063.
Yes.
So 35 years.
Yes, yes,
2 generations.
exactly.
That's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, well,
we've never seen that in the world before.
The population birth rate in Africa is 2.5%. There's no other region. Every other region is under 1%, in their population birth. So it's huge. And also life expectancy is longer. Infant mortality has gone down. So there's more people and they're younger people on the continent. And so that demographic boom, as we say, could either be very positive or very negative. And it will be positive only if the economies can generate the jobs.
So one thing I just heard that I was quite taken by, surprised by, is that more Africans are sending their kids to university today in China
Yes,
than in the United States.
yes.
That's pretty dramatic. You certainly feel the investment from China
Yes.
when you're on the ground, almost anywhere in the continent.
Yes.
What do you think that means practically on the ground in Africa?
They're sending more children. More African children are going to school in China than in the United States and the UK combined. So it is significant. I think it's really, it's something different has taken place. China's trade with Africa is much greater than the United States, by 3 or 4-fold at this point in time. The investment is more significant. I think that really what it means is that China's influence on the continent is going to be, it's a geostrategic play and it's an economic play, right? And I say that because China's economy has been fueled by African commodities. Right, it's chrome and coal and gold and all of the different raw materials that China, oil, et cetera, that China's been taking out of Africa.
Right.
Africa also is a market for Chinese consumer goods. So it's a big play that China's making. And when you start looking at how much time the president of China has been spending in Africa, Xi Jinping. He spent, let's say, his first term, he went to Africa 3 times, and he went in the first year. He was just in Africa in July of this year of his second, right? And so it really just says that
And he also brings the African leaders all to China on a regular basis.
Yes, they just had their forum there. I think it was in August. Yeah, so really, they've made a big play in Africa. Now they're also doing the soft power aspect. It's one thing to take the minerals out, deal with governments, but now when you have young people going to school there, you get the people-to-people exchange. You have more Chinese tourists coming into Africa. They've changed some of their practices. People would always say, well, the Chinese have only Chinese workers working on these big infrastructure projects. It's no longer true. Now they're Africans and they're training Africans on these infrastructure projects. So
you don't see the same sort of blowback from Chinese investment, neo-colonization among the Africans today that you did 10, 20 years ago?
You do hear some resentment. You especially hear resentment from people on the street who are what in Kenya we call juakali, the people who work out on the street, the traders. When there are Chinese traders out there as well competing with them, for those markets. So you do hear some blowback, but quite frankly, I think most African countries and leaders are happy to have the investment in their economies. Now, there's a lot of blowback from the West towards Africa, saying, you guys have to be careful, you're letting them invest too much, you're taking out too many loans with them. But then the Africans will just say to the United States, I'm sorry, but isn't China one of your biggest trading partners? And haven't they bought a lot of your economy? And don't they owe a lot of your debt? And so they're like, if it's good enough for you, why isn't it good enough for us?
Fair amount of corporate investment. Melania just went there.
We're not there.
We're not there.
We're not there.
We're absent.
Particularly when you see it in comparison to China, right? We're just not there. No, I mean, there is some military activity in Niger and in Somalia, but we're not present really on the continent. You know, Chinese now are putting peacekeepers on the ground. So we don't do that. Our companies are hindered from actually investing. I do a lot of work with companies, and quite frankly, especially our big corporates, you know, their legal departments won't let them go into Africa hardly because of fear of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So it's a challenge for American companies to invest. There's a market. There's a huge potential market, but it's also a market that's still divided. You know, so when we talk about the market, we're like, oh, it's a $10 trillion market and it's 1 billion people. If you put all 54 countries
54
together,
countries, yeah.
But it's not true for the, you know, all of these little countries you're navigating. And so it's not the easiest place to invest if we're being honest about that. And so American companies have to really be persistent. They can make a lot of money. The companies that are there are the ones in the extractives, you know, the oil companies and others, you know, mining companies that are American corporations that are there. The telecoms are increasingly there. FinTech, you know, is increasingly there. But it's not easy.
We haven't talked about the terrorism issue, the radicalism issue. And with extreme poverty frequently comes extremist ideologies. Certainly feels like it's growing. Many have said that the bigger al-Qaeda problem in the future will be coming out of Africa as opposed to the Middle East. How do you feel about that? How are we doing, not just the U.S., but broadly, in the effort to contain, combat, and perhaps reduce that level?
It is a challenge. You know, the ISIS connecting with Boko Haram should really be something that gives everyone pause and to say we really need to do a better job here. How can we work with the continent to stem this radicalization which is taking place, which includes, frankly, working with the emirs of northern Nigeria, right, who have a special relationship with the population, you know, and can speak to them in their own language, you know, not only just, you know, I mean their language, including their religious language. And so I think that we really need some homegrown answers, and African countries need to help with some capacity. If you think about the Sambisa forest, which is where Boko Haram operates in Nigeria, it's 2 times the size of Belgium, right? And so actually policing...
I mean, Belgium is pretty small, to be fair, but yes.
But that's just one small part of Nigeria.
Right. Yeah.
Right? It's just a forest in Nigeria, right? And so how do you police that area? How do you get control over your territory? You know, security control over your territory. And so I think that that's an area where we do need a lot more effort. Frankly, the same could be said of al-Shabaab in Somalia, right? Where right now the United States, I think, as a policy, is trying to push the UN to actually reduce the presence of the African forces in Somalia, who are trying to help that government get on its feet so that it can police its territory itself. And so there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that area. Actually, the South Africans have done a very good job, but very quietly, they've quietly done an excellent job of dealing with not only global terrorism, i.e. coming out of the Middle East and other places, but also domestic terrorism. And I think that, you know, there's some lessons that we could learn from them as well.
Jendayi Frazer.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much.
And now I've got puppets for you. Puppets, little furry puppets. Puppet Regime is next. Hi, everyone. It's the holiday season, and this Thanksgiving, President Trump has invited the world to his table to deliver a special Thanksgiving message.
Hello, everyone from around the world. Welcome to this Thanksgiving dinner. You're welcome. What did you bring to thank me? This holiday constrains American power. This is... Easy, John.
We have problems with Turkey in Russia, so I brought you this teacup. Would anyone like?
I would not drink this.
Donald, I brought you these delicious Chinese apple pears and also these 24-pack of paper towels.
Well, I don't love China, but if it's your pears or Ivanka's handbags, I'm very grateful.
Monsieur Trump, why is this seat at the end of the table empty?
It's not empty. Look closely. To be festive, I invited the 0.00024% of Elizabeth Warren that's Native American. Diversity matters.
Ja, das ist why I brought a Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte.
A what? I'm sure I hate that. Sounds like something one of Steve Miller's sicko friends would have brought. Monsieur Trump, what did you bring? The bill.
C'est what?
The bill. For years of America putting food on the table for you freeloaders. All of you out. And by all of you, I mean Angela and Emmanuel. You other guys can stay.
That's our show this week. We'll be right here next week. Don't miss it. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, and I know you do, I know you really do, because it's been awesome, check us out on gzeromedia.com.